Hey everybody, we're the good doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I am Dr. Kristen.
You're very welcome to our YouTube channel and our final coverage for this month of Black History Month, the month of February in the United States, where we have been taking a tour around parts of the continent of Africa, looking at the diversity of women's experiences in several different places. Our final landing point for this month is the country of Egypt, which is in Africa, the North African part that is predominantly Islamic and Muslim in religion for hosts of reasons of colonization, but still very significant part of Africa and its history. And we don't often talk about women from that part of the world either. So we found a film from 2009, I believe, called Scheherazade, Tell Me a Story. Scheherazade is, as we learned, the narrator of 1001 Nights or Arabian Nights, very famous series of stories and tales. And she is the narrator. She's the wife of a sultan who is forced to continue to tell stories in order to gain the trust of the man who is saving her life. I don't know any more details than that because that's literally what the summary told me. If anybody else has more information, cool. But the point of this is to kind of frame the movie around this idea of a woman telling stories. And that's where we get our protagonist, Hebba Hunes, who is a TV personality for Sun TV in Cairo. She's married to Karim, who works for the state press and is vying for an editor-in-chief position. And she has this kind of like sit down night. It's kind of like Charlie Rose. Like
yeah, a little bit.
A little bit like she has a guest on and they talk about whatever stories of interest. And she was doing too much politics. And her husband hears from the state that she needs to tone it down a little and do some softball stories, talk about women. So she's like, cool, I'm a woman, I can talk about women. And she proceeds to then have 3 consecutive guests on her show that tell her their stories of what happened to them. And they end up being very critical of the patriarchy of male-dominated society, of the way women are treated.
Spoiler alert, everything is political, so you can't actually have a show that's not political. And
yeah, you
that's
can't
one of the points of the story.
Yeah, and they get to that point literally, and her husband tells her like everything you're doing,
everything
you're doing politics because everything is political.
Yeah.
Which I was super excited to hear because that's one of the hills Dr. Kristen and I will die on when people are like, oh, we have to take the politics out of it. We're like, you can't.
That's physically impossible.
You can't. So we can, as we just discussed offline, conservatively talk about this film for about 5 hours with all of the things.
Conservatively.
With all the
things. I can talk entirely about her wardrobe for 2. So
yes, the actress who plays Hebba is fantastic. All the women are fantastic. It's very well acted. There's parts of the movie that we don't love, some really long drawn out stories. It is a little over 2 hours. Apparently you read that it's a tradition within Arab movies to kind of be slower and take more time telling stories. So that's an important thing to know. But we get these 3 stories of these women and how their stories change Hebba and change the way that she sees the world and change the way that she sees her marriage and her primary relationship. And then technically the final story is Hebba's story as she becomes a guest on her own show. So
before we launch into talking about the characters, a couple of things really quickly is that this was an official selection at a number of film festivals.
This is a big deal, apparently.
And we tried to find as many reviews as we could. The Western media generally loved this. There's reviews in the New York Times and in the Hollywood Reporter that were very glowing. Obviously, our inability to speak and read Egyptian limits us a little bit. I did look on things like Rotten Tomatoes and try to find some criticism, of which there was some, but largely it was around things that we actually quite enjoyed, like how visceral it was and how, kind of thing it is. In terms of Western pacing of a movie in 2009, I definitely would have wanted things to move faster than they do now. than they do in this movie. This movie's pacing felt to me like an 80s drama in Hollywood. Like everything is just stretched a little bit.
It was very, and I saw it described somewhere as art house, and it's very kind of art house.
Yes.
Artsy shots, long shots
of food, like just a lot of things. Yes, if I was watching this in an independent cinema in Philly,
yeah,
if I was watching this at the AMC in Oxford Valley, I would have been a little bit more.
I would have been like, "What is this?"
What is happening?
So, but I think a lot of that is, you're right, like our cultural expectations, especially if traditionally in Arab speaking countries, maybe they take longer to tell stories, and that's normal.
And that comes from like a couple friends of mine who have lived in Tunis and are on the other kind of one of the other cultures within the Arab and speaking within the Arabic speaking world is Persian. And a lot of the traditions around storytelling in those cultures are a lot about like, that was the whole entertainment. That's your night. And that's what you do.
And I think that's like the fact that they modeled it after 1001 Nights.
Yeah.
It was intentional to kind of.
Yeah, it was intentional to.
Yeah.
Even with all that being said, if we could just be entitled Western Princesses for a minute, the middle vignette, you could have lost a hot 20 out of that.
Yeah, one. Yeah. Safa and Saeed's story, Safa and her two sisters and their Saeed, who works in their father's shop, that we really could have sucked.
Yeah, you just could have crunched that one
more out of that. And still gotten a lot of important stuff.
Oh my gosh. And I actually think it would have made the more important stuff stand out more, because so much of, at least me, and if anyone's watched this, one of our delights of our YouTube channels, we know that people watch us from all around the world. So if you're watching us from somewhere you have access to this film and you've watched it, we found it on Amazon Prime in the United States, by the way. But tell us if we're right or wrong, but like so much of that story I spent trying to figure out what we were doing in it,
what was happening. Yeah.
And so like everything, for instance, that she goes to prison before you start the vignette. And so then every detail that came at me, I was like, is this why she goes to prison?
Yeah.
Why she goes to prison? Is this who she kills? And it didn't let me enjoy the story at all. So yeah, that would be my one major critique. The other vignettes were like a little bit confusing, but that could just be my brain. But yeah,
but by the third one, I knew the pattern we were following. So
correct.
It was also the shortest one, I think.
Yeah, the third one was the shortest one, but the most graphic.
Yeah, and I think like similarly, if any of you watched our video on The Wedding Party, the Nigerian rom-com, which I felt similarly in that I was spending too long trying to figure out what was happening.
Yeah.
And so I felt kind of blindsided by some of the really significant things that happen in this movie, and a lot of them do, because I was always trying to figure out where we were going.
Yep.
And that could be cultural, that could be the translation of English from the Arabic, that could be a whole host of things. But I concur with Dr. Kristen. I never felt like I got my footing until there was maybe like 25 minutes left in the movie.
All that to say, those criticisms aside, those themes aside, what this movie, pre-Arab Spring, by the way, which fascinates me.
I'm just blown away by that.
The stereotypes that we were given about Egyptian culture prior to the Arab Spring would not have produced this kind of cinema. And so I am incredibly glad to be corrected in the stereotypes that I was fed by American media at this time. I think the two main themes for me are the tension of globalization versus local culture, and then the incredible power of women. But the overall theme is the absolute unending, inescapable patriarchy that privileges male experiences and male comfort over everything else. And in this movie, the state of Egypt is also portrayed as male. The state itself is male. It's run by men. It prioritizes men. It privileges men. It privileges their opinions and their feelings and all those kind of things. And so undergirded is the patriarchy. And when we could talk forever about that, we are going to spoil a couple things here. So if anything we've said up to this point makes you want to enjoy the movie, please stop now and join us after you've watched everything. But I think that there was something intentional about the fact that it took a woman asking these questions to get these answers, that all she was asking was their life stories.
Mm-hmm.
That's all she wanted to do, was just know their love lives. Oh, but wait, their love lives include being verbally abused. Their love lives include being cheated on. Their love lives include having abortions. Their love lives include deciding to have children or not, which are all political entities, especially in a country in which the state is represented as male.
Yeah, and I think there's a beauty in the fact that she wanted to simplify their, like, coming at their stories through that simplistic lens. Like, tell me a story. Scheherazade, tell me a story. Like, what happened? And even in the interviews, you get that from her questions. And she was like, yeah, but why did you think that? Or what did you do that for?
Yeah.
Why did you get arrested? And some of the stories were known and some of them weren't. The middle vignette, Safa, she talks about, like, everyone in the press, everyone knows my story. Everyone knows my story. But, through what lens and from what perspective, and you don't get the impression that she had the chance to really tell it in that detail. And for me, obviously, I agree in terms of the main theme being the oppression of women through the systemic patriarchy in society, and all the different ways in which women have to grapple with relationships and society and how they're viewed. And it was done in really subtle ways.
Yeah.
There's, in the first vignette, there's a fantastic conversation between the woman, and I did not write down her name, and this man who is courting her, where he's like, I think we should get married, and here's my list, and you're going to do the cleaning and the cooking and all of this.
And you're going to give me all your money, and you're not ever going to drive a car again. And
I want you to wear the veil. And she sits there and she's like, okay, taking notes. At the end, she goes, so what am I getting out of this? And he was like, well, you get a husband. She was like, well, what does that mean? And he can't, she wants love. That's the point of her story. She didn't want to marry until she was in love with someone. And she ends up in an asylum. I could not tell if it was because she entered it or she was forced into it. Did you get that?
No, I think what I interpreted is that the circumstances of her life led her to a chemical imbalance in which she felt she was manic depressive, and she entered the asylum. But I'm also unclear as to at what point any level of consent entered her life, because the power of choosing to tell her story seemed to be like a plot point.
Yeah.
Like, hey, this is the first time she's had full consent, and she's going to use it this way. So my impression was that but she'd said manic depressive a few times.
Yeah.
Hebba did. So I that's a piece of this. But that was not clear to me in terms of actual enthusiastic consent.
Yeah, and consent is such a huge part of this, and power, and the way women can have power in society if they do, and that's a dynamic in all three of their stories, all four of their stories, but really interestingly explored through the middle vignette, where we get a look at these three young women who are effectively orphaned. Their mother died an indeterminate amount of time ago, and in this story their father dies, and they have no brothers. They have an uncle is the only one that can protect them, but they're smart and they're independent, and they kind of want to take charge. And of all the four stories of the women in this movie, that's also a feature in it. And being a traditional woman in that society, what that means and what is expected of you, and how you can struggle to fit those boundaries.
Even if you want to fit those boundaries in some ways, like, even if part of it, the impression I got from the first vignette is that she didn't want to have sex till she got married. Like, that's a cultural value that she bought into.
Yeah.
And that is, I don't think we talk about that enough when we do movies about women in particular, or there are some of us that want the things that people think are wrong. And how does this, I could have sat with that for a lot longer.
I know. And I think, I think Hebba as well, our protagonist,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't get the impression that she was unhappy caring for her husband and doing the cooking and filling some of those traditional roles, but she also wanted, the independence and the agency to run her own show and to tell the stories that she wanted to tell. um, and they eventually come to a very tragic head over that issue. But yeah, the fact that it complicated women always makes me happy to see that we are all complex human beings, regardless of gender or sex or identity. And any story that's going to take the time to show that we can be complex and challenging humans, I am here for. And that's, I think, what it did really beautifully in this.
Also, I think just not for nothing, this is the first time I've ever seen an abortion on screen.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about that a lot offline, and that happens in the third vignette. And like, Dr. Kristen finished the movie before I did, and she told me that it happens, and I was like, because she wasn't sure. She was like, I think that's what's happening, and I'm not
But it
sure.
was one of those like, am I truly watching a film? We don't show these things on film.
I
Like, how
know.
could that be what it is? I must have misunderstood.
Y'all, so this is so funny because, and it's funny and also really interesting because it tells you how, I guess, puritanical our culture is, in that she told me that that's what she thought she saw. I read a review in where it said there's an abortion. And I was watching the scene and I was like, oh my God, they're actually showing it. Yes,
Yeah.
Aaron, you were told by a movie review and your best friend that they're showing it. But I was still like, oh my God, they're really
They're showing it.
I cannot think of a time
No.
that, or a film that
No.
I've seen that shows it
Including sex ed videos.
for real, especially sex ed videos. And we talked about the language of it because we were like, graphically, like it shows it graphically, but that makes it sound like
It shows it like a surgical procedure.
it is. Yeah, it shows.
It's surgery.
I want to say like it shows it realistically, like
It shows it medically. Yeah.
medically what it looks like to get an abortion, and like the power of putting that on film.
And again, if in 2009, if you had told me and my little, I was in grad school in Central Texas, and if you had said, hey, by the way, there's a Egyptian movie that actually shows an abortion on screen, I would have been like, no.
Like shows the results of the medical procedure, I would have been like,
shows the medical procedure, I would have been like, no, that's not possible. So one of the things I love about this project that we have embarked on, as we seek to help other people develop their empathy and develop our own, is the incredible ways that we are being corrected.
Yeah, and challenged. I love it.
I love it so much. I'm so grateful for it. I'm so grateful for all these streaming services that I don't have to go to an art house theater. Again, this is becoming an Abby Research bingo card, but the democratization of content
it's massive,
is something we will celebrate for a long time. And this is a great example of a movie that if Amazon had not bought it, there's no way I would have ever encountered this thing. And I'm so grateful.
Yeah. And like, honestly, and I think about like where we are in our lives, and we're in our late 30s, and if we had access to these kinds of movies earlier, like just the power that it can have to show you different worlds and different perspectives, and to challenge you, to change your assumptions and your stereotypes, and to understand another culture and to walk in other people's shoes, like all those things that it can do. And especially for those people that might not be living in areas where they have access to movies.
Like I grew up in like outside of Philadelphia, which obviously like I can go to New York. Art house cinema is still really hard to get to.
It's hard to get to and it's hard to access. And
hard.
There's not a lot of them open. Especially probably I would imagine not many of them will survive COVID. So unfortunately for now anyway, so any chance we can have to access these. And, as we're filming this the other day, we planned out the cultural content for the rest of this year. And we're going all over the world and finding all of these really fantastic art projects that people have done to tell these stories. And we're real geeked out about it.
And we'll tell you more about that when you join us next week here on the channel. So definitely do that. One brief final note about why we're doing this in Black History Month. And you may be looking at us and saying, but Egyptians aren't Black people. You are correct. One of the kind of tiny shifts we wanted to make is, again, the celebration of the entirety of the continent of Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And the Black experience globally is very shaped by Africa, whether or not people can trace their lineage back to it or not. The African colonizer experience is very shaped. The Black experience is very shaped by the African colonies, is very shaped by the Caribbean colonization of the Caribbean islands. It's all very shaped. And I am wary of anyone who wants to do study of kind of any part of Africa and try to take it in a vacuum, because yes, there is a definitive religious divide, and we can talk about the colonization practices, and then also just the, like, no one can live in the Sahara Desert. Like, you just can't. So north and south of that is a different ball game, and like how people can, the topography of Africa is so vast. But there are Pan-African decision makers. And when I say that word, my guess is you think of all Black people. And guess what? There's a lot of Arab descended folks and Arab ethnic folks that call Africa home too. So we wanted to problematize that a little bit. We here at Abbey Research try to celebrate Black lives as often as possible. We believe deeply that they matter. So please don't take this this content in this week, in this month, as any sort of
erasure.
Thank you. From that principle, we simply wanted to broaden the conversation of what Africa is. And we will continue to do that as we kind of move forward throughout the rest of the year.
That's right. So up next in the month of March for us, we are starting our Colonizers World Tour. That's what we're calling it, as a nod to Shuri from the Black Panther series. We're going to look at all of the parts of the world that were colonized, which is pretty much all of the world. And we're going to go
share a map with you, and I think you would be surprised because we were too.
Just who colonized what places of the world. So first up, chapter 1, month of March, we are doing places that were never colonized by Europe. That does not mean they weren't colonized. We'll get into that. We are going to Thailand, Antarctica, North and South Korea, and Japan. So
according to this map we found on Reddit, those are the only 4 countries that weren't at least partially colonized by Europe.
It's going to be fun. I think it's going to be a great way for us to learn a whole host of things. I'm already excited about the places we're going to go, and we hope you will join us next week for Thailand.
See you there.
Bye.